Welcome to History Teller YT, where forgotten voices and untold stories come alive. Today, we journey deep into the history of the Kolibugan, a people born from the fusion of two worlds, the indigenous Subanen and the Islamic Moro tradition. Their story is one of survival, resilience, and adaptation, shaped by centuries of migration, intermarriage, colonization, rebellion, and cultural preservation. From the flowing rivers of Zamboanga to the struggles of land dispossession, from the rituals of their ancestors to the modern challenges of identity and recognition, the Kolibugan stand as living proof that culture is never static. It evolves, it bends, but it never breaks. Stay with me until the end, because in this history, you'll not only discover who the Kolibugan are, but you'll also uncover powerful lessons about identity, resilience, and the strength of preserving one's roots in a world that constantly demands change. The story of the Kolibugan begins long before the name itself was ever spoken, in the lush river valleys and fertile mountainsides of Mindanao. At the heart of this history are the Subanen people, whose very name comes from the word Suba, meaning river, and Nen meaning people. For centuries, they lived in scattered communities along the winding waterways of the Zamboanga Peninsula. These rivers were not just a source of life. They were the central pathways of movement, trade, and myth. Subanen society revolved around water as a giver of fertility and a highway of connection. To live by the river meant sustenance through fishing, irrigation for swidden farming, and access to neighboring communities. Their identity as people of the river expressed a profound harmony with the natural world, a rhythm of life guided by the cycles of water, planting, and harvest. The Subanen worldview was deeply spiritual, rooted in animistic traditions. Every river, mountain, and forest had spirits, guardians that had to be respected and honored. Rituals marked the planting season, the harvest, and even the hunt, with offerings made to unseen beings believed to control the balance of the world. This spiritual ecology preserved the interconnectedness of humans and nature, ensuring that no single act disrupted the larger cosmic balance. These beliefs, preserved in oral traditions, shaped how the Subanen governed themselves and interacted with outsiders. Yet, though they lived inland and upland, the Subanen were never entirely isolated. Their coastal cousins ventured downriver to fish, gather salt, and trade forest goods with seafaring peoples. This placed them at the margins of wider networks that extended across the Sulu Sea and beyond. The seeds of cultural exchange and transformation were already planted here, though they would not fully blossom until centuries later when the Kolibugan identity began to emerge from this Subanen foundation. Before the arrival of Islam or the pressures of colonial expansion, Subanen society developed a way of life that was both simple and deeply symbolic. Communities were generally small, organized into households bound by kinship ties. Leadership came from the Timue, a figure respected not for wealth, but for wisdom, mediation skills, and the ability to keep peace within the village. The Timue's authority extended to settling disputes, guiding rituals, and maintaining the delicate relationship between humans and the spirit world. Subsistence revolved around swidden agriculture, clearing small patches of land on hillsides to plant rice, corn, and root crops. Hunting and fishing supplemented diets, while forest gathering provided medicinal herbs, timber, and materials for weaving. Women held vital roles in planting, harvesting, and household weaving traditions, while men often took charge of clearing land and fishing expeditions. Though life was difficult and precarious, with storms and sickness always present, it was also communal and interdependent. Rituals and oral epics carried the stories of ancestors, often performed through dances, chants, and the sacred bucklog ritual. The bucklog, recognized by UNESCO in modern times, is one of the most remarkable expressions of Subanen identity. A towering wooden platform is built, and as participants dance on it, the rhythmic sound echoes through the forest, symbolizing the link between the world of humans and the world of spirits. This ritual was not mere entertainment. It was an act of cultural survival, a way to maintain harmony with unseen powers that controlled health, fertility, and the success of the harvest. In these traditions, we see the DNA of what would later become Kolibugan culture. Even as Islam would arrive and take root in coastal Subanen communities, the memory of the bucklog, the authority of the Timue, and the reverence for ancestral spirits would persist, submerged beneath new practices but never entirely erased. Though often imagined as isolated highlanders, the Subanen had centuries of subtle interactions with outsiders. The rivers that sustained them also carried them toward the sea, where they encountered traders, fisherfolk, and seafarers from neighboring groups. The Tazug of Sulu, the Samabajo Sea people, and Maguindanao merchants were among the earliest to form bonds with the coastal Subanen. These interactions were initially economic, exchanging forest products like resin, honey, and rattan for salt, fish, and metal tools. But through trade came more than material goods. It carried new languages, customs, and spiritual influences. By the 14th century, the great sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao had already begun weaving vast networks of political and cultural power across Mindanao and the islands. Their influence extended not only through warfare and diplomacy, but also through marriage alliances. Subanen women, known for their beauty and skill in weaving, often married Muslim men from neighboring groups. These unions were not only familial but strategic, linking Subanen villages into broader alliances that offered protection, trade benefits, and prestige. It was in these intermarriages that the seeds of Islamization first took root. Children raised in such households were often taught Islamic prayers, basic Arabic expressions, and elements of Muslim law, even as they remained tied to the Subanen ancestral traditions. For generations, this duality existed side by side. Ancestral rituals conducted in the mountains and Islamic practices emerging along the coast. The Kalibugan identity was already forming, not as a sudden conversion, but as a gradual layering of influences. This blending was not without tension. Some upland Subanen resisted the influence of the sultanates, retreating deeper inland to preserve their ancestral ways. Others embraced the changes, finding strength in the new networks of Islam. In this push and pull of tradition and transformation, the Kolibugan were born, descendants of both the river and the crescent, shaped by centuries of contact and adaptation. The earliest waves of Islamic influence upon the Subanen, who would later evolve into the Kolibugan, did not arrive through conquest or mass preaching, but quietly, subtly, and persistently through trade. The coastal world of Mindanao in the 14th and 15th centuries was a dynamic crossroads, where Tazig, Sama, Maguindanao, and even Chinese traders exchanged not only goods but also ideas, rituals, and ways of life. Subanen communities living near the mouths of rivers were particularly well positioned to encounter these seafaring peoples. Honey, beeswax, rattan, and forest resins were brought downriver and traded for salt, cloth, ceramics, and iron tools. In these seemingly simple exchanges lay the first channels of cultural transformation. Traders were not simply sellers of goods, they were cultural ambassadors. Tazig merchants often carried with them Islamic objects such as prayer beads, Quranic verses inscribed on palm leaf scrolls, or amulets inscribed with Arabic calligraphy. These items were not always presented in overtly religious contexts. Sometimes they were exchanged as charms believed to have protective powers, resonating with Subanen beliefs in talismans and spiritual mediators. The visual beauty of Arabic script itself impressed local peoples, who began to associate it with mystical strength and prestige. Over repeated visits, traders did more than transact. They established trust, shared meals, and told stories. In the evenings, when the day's trade was done, merchants recited prayers before eating or retiring to sleep, practices that Subanen hosts observed with curiosity. Slowly, the rhythm of Islamic life, prayers, greetings, dietary customs, began to filter into Subanen households. What began as economic contact thus evolved into social and spiritual contact. The sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao were highly strategic in using trade as a missionary tool. By ensuring that their traders were also cultural transmitters, they extended their influence far beyond their immediate political territories. For the Subanen along the coast of Zamboanga, these encounters were less threatening than warfare or forced conversion. Instead, they represented opportunity, access to new goods, protection from raiders, and entry into expansive regional networks of power. The Kolibugan identity was thus seeded not through sudden rupture, but through this patient, generational introduction of Islam via trade. While trade opened the door for Islamic practices to enter Subanen communities, it was marriage that firmly anchored these new influences into the social fabric. In the highly kinship-oriented world of the Subanen, marriage was never just a personal decision. It was a political, economic, and spiritual alliance. By the late 14th century, Tazig, Sama, and Maguindanao men frequently married Subanen women from coastal villages, creating households that embodied a dual heritage. These marriages were mutually advantageous. For the Muslim seafarers and traders, marrying a Subanen woman meant gaining access to inland resources and forming bonds with local kinship networks that could guarantee safe passage and long-term trade stability. For the Subanen, marrying into a Muslim family provided not only prestige, but also protection. Affiliation with a powerful sultanate, even indirectly, shielded them from slave raids and hostile incursions by rival groups. Within these households, the children grew up bilingual and bicultural. They inherited the Subanen traditions of reverence for rivers, mountains, and ancestral spirits. But they also learned the Islamic faith through the father's teachings or the community mosque. A young boy might join his father in Friday prayers, while also accompanying his mother in offering rice and betel nut to the river spirits during planting rituals. A young girl might weave cloth in the Subanen style, while also learning Quranic recitations and Islamic modesty practices. This intermingling created a unique social environment where Islam was neither foreign nor entirely dominant. It blended into the Subanen worldview in gradual, organic ways. Weddings themselves became syncretic affairs, with traditional Subanen rites harmonized with Islamic Nika rituals. Death rituals, too, reflected this fusion. Quranic prayers offered alongside indigenous chants to guide the spirit. The identity of the Kolibugan, which literally means mixed or half-breed, emerged precisely out of these kinship webs. The label itself was not initially a derogatory one, but descriptive of a reality. These were people who lived in two worlds simultaneously. They were not fully Subanen in the old sense, nor fully Moro in the Orthodox Islamic sense, but something new and distinct. They embodied a bridge culture, one that could negotiate with both upland Subanen kin and seafaring Muslim relatives. Over generations, this blending crystallized into a community identity that outsiders came to recognize as Kolibugan. The Islamization of the Kalibugan was neither instantaneous nor complete. It was instead a gradual layering of influences that coexisted with older Subanen practices for centuries. At first, only certain aspects of Islam were adopted: prayers before meals, avoidance of pork, or burial practices that aligned with Muslim customs. These practices were relatively easy to harmonize with existing traditions. A Subanen household could still honor the spirits of rivers and forests while following new dietary restrictions. For instance, this selective adaptation reflected a deep pragmatism. The Kolibugan were not passive recipients of culture. They actively chose which elements to embrace and how to integrate them. In many cases, Islamic customs were adopted because they enhanced social standing, provided access to wider networks, or resonated with pre-existing beliefs. For example, the Subanen belief in spirit guardians made it natural to accept the Islamic concept of angels and jinn. Similarly, their reverence for sacred chants and rituals allowed them to appreciate Quranic recitation as a powerful spiritual practice. Over time, however, the influence of the sultanates deepened. Muslim teachers and missionaries, often respected as scholars or healers, visited Kolibugan villages, introducing more structured aspects of the faith. Mosques were built in coastal communities, becoming centers not only of worship, but also of political connection to larger Islamic polities. Islamic law began to influence village governance, particularly in matters of marriage, inheritance, and conflict resolution. Yet, throughout this period, the Subanen spiritual backbone persisted. The bucklog ritual continued to be performed, ancestral spirits continued to be invoked, and the authority of the Timue remained significant. The Kolibugan identity, therefore, never became a complete replacement of Subanen culture with Islam. Rather, it became a syncretic synthesis. This syncretism was not static either. It adapted to the needs of each generation, shifting balance depending on political alliances, economic pressures, and spiritual demands. By the dawn of Spanish colonization in the 16th century, the Kolibugan had already emerged as a recognizable community, distinct from both their upland Subanen kin and their fully Islamized Moro neighbors. They occupied a liminal space, coastal yet upland, indigenous yet Islamic, Subanen yet Moro. This hybridity, born of trade, intermarriage, and gradual transformation, would become the defining feature of their historical trajectory. It would also prepare them for the challenges and upheavals of colonial encounters still to come. By the 15th and 16th centuries, two great political and cultural powers dominated the southern Philippines: the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Mindanao. These Muslim polities were more than just kingdoms. They were sprawling maritime states that controlled trade routes, demanded tribute, and fostered wide networks of alliances across islands and coastal settlements. Their influence extended across Mindanao, Sulu, Palawan, and even to parts of Borneo. For the Subanen living along the western coast of the Zamboanga Peninsula, this expansion was not a distant matter. It touched their daily lives, reshaping their identities and loyalties. The Sultanate of Sulu, with its capital in Holo, was renowned for its control of sea trade and its ability to mobilize fleets of Tazig warriors and Samabajo seafarers. Through diplomacy and strategic marriages, the Sulu rulers extended their reach into Zamboanga's coastal villages. Their emissaries carried both political authority and Islamic faith, binding local leaders into networks of allegiance. Meanwhile, the Sultanate of Mindanao, based further east, expanded its power across the Pulangi River Valley, establishing authority over central Mindanao and forging ties with surrounding groups. Its rulers were skilled at balancing military strength with religious legitimacy, often presenting themselves as protectors of Islam in the archipelago. For the Kolibugan, these sultanates were not abstract entities. They became real presences in the form of emissaries, datus, and traders who demanded recognition of their authority. Coastal Kolibugan villages were gradually woven into tributary systems, offering forest products, wax, or labor in exchange for protection and prestige. In return, the sultanates offered legitimacy, recognizing Kolibugan leaders as local chiefs under their greater authority. This recognition elevated the Kolibugans' status, distinguishing them from their upland Subanen relatives who remained outside these networks. The presence of the sultanates also brought more structured Islamic practices. Mosques were erected, imams were sent to teach, and religious rituals became increasingly institutionalized. Yet the Kolibugan did not absorb Islam in a purely orthodox way. They adapted it to their own realities. Local spirits continued to be venerated alongside Allah, and the Timue system of leadership coexisted with Islamic law. What emerged was a hybrid governance structure, one foot in Subanen tradition and another in Islamic authority. This dual allegiance reflected their liminal status, both indigenous and Moro, both subjects of the river and vassals of the sultanates. As the Kolibugan became increasingly tied to the sultanates, the role of their traditional leaders, the Timue, underwent significant transformation. In earlier Subanen life, the Timue was a village elder, chosen for wisdom, fairness, and the ability to mediate disputes. His authority was moral and spiritual rather than coercive, rooted in the belief that harmony with the spirits could only be maintained if justice prevailed. When Islam entered Kolibugan life, the Timue's authority did not disappear, it adapted. Many Timue embraced the new faith, integrating Islamic values into their leadership. They began to preside over marriages that combined Subanen ritual with Islamic nikah, and they mediated disputes using a mix of customary law and Sharia principles. Their flexibility allowed Kolibugan communities to maintain continuity even amid change. Far from being replaced by Muslim datus or sultanate-appointed leaders, the Timue often became the crucial link between indigenous traditions and the new Islamic order. Kinship also played a central role in this adaptation. Families intermarried not only across Subanen and Muslim lines, but also within Kolibugan communities themselves, producing extended kin networks that tied villages together. These kinship webs became the foundation of both economic cooperation and political negotiation. Through kinship, authority was legitimized, and through authority, cultural identity was preserved even as it evolved. Yet tensions were inevitable. Some upland Subanen criticized the Kolibugan for abandoning the old ways, while more orthodox Muslims sometimes viewed them as incomplete converts who blended Islam with animism. The Kolibugan, however, saw themselves differently, not as betrayers of tradition or half-hearted Muslims, but as a people who had created a culture of balance. Their identity rested precisely on this ability to harmonize seemingly opposite traditions into a functioning whole. By the 16th century, the Timue system had become a symbol of Kolibugan resilience. These leaders embodied both ancestral continuity and adaptability to new structures of power. In doing so, they safeguarded the community's autonomy, ensuring that Kolibugan society remained distinct even under the shadow of the powerful sultanates. This capacity for adaptation would prove critical when yet another force, the Spanish colonizers, entered their world as Kolibugan communities became increasingly integrated into the networks of the sultanates, their relationships with neighboring Moro groups grew more complex. On one hand, these ties offered protection, trade opportunities, and religious solidarity. On the other, they exposed the Kolibugan to the dangers of intergroup rivalries, slave raiding, and political conflict. The Tazig, in particular, were both allies and competitors. As dominant seafarers, the Tazig frequently demanded tribute and labor from Kolibugan villages. Some Kolibugan were recruited into maritime raids against Spanish-controlled settlements, gaining prestige and material rewards in return. Others, however, found themselves on the receiving end of these raids when tribute obligations were unmet. This duality, being both allies and victims, illustrated the precarious position of the Kolibugan within the Sultanate system. The Samabajo, with their deep seafaring traditions, often acted as mediators between coastal Kolibugan and the Sultanates. Their mobile lifestyle allowed them to bridge communities, facilitating trade and intermarriage. Through them, the Kolibugan gained access to broader maritime networks that stretched across the Sulu Sea and even toward Borneo. Yet, this also meant increased dependence on external forces, reducing their autonomy in coastal affairs. The Maguindanao influence was felt more strongly inland, where Kolibugan communities on the eastern edges of Zamboanga encountered emissaries and traders from the Polongi River Valley. These interactions often revolved around agricultural exchange. Kolibugan rice and forest products traded for Maguindanao textiles and weaponry. In these exchanges, Islamization deepened further, reinforced by the authority of Maguindanao imams who brought more structured teachings into Kolibugan villages. Caught between alliances and obligations, the Kolibugan developed remarkable diplomatic skills. They learned to negotiate with multiple powers simultaneously, leveraging their unique position as both Subanen descendants and Islamic converts. This ability to navigate conflicting loyalties became part of their cultural identity, a survival strategy that allowed them to maintain autonomy despite being surrounded by more powerful neighbors. By the time the Spanish began their incursions into Mindanao in the late 16th century, the Kolibugan were already seasoned negotiators in a complex political landscape. Their hybrid identity had been tested in the fires of alliance, conflict, and adaptation, preparing them for the even greater upheavals that colonialism would bring. The arrival of the Spanish in the Philippines in the 16th century marked the beginning of an era of immense disruption for all indigenous and Muslim peoples of Mindanao, including the Kolibugan. When Spanish forces under Miguel Lopez de Legazpi first arrived in 1565, their conquest focused initially on Luzon and the Visayas. But soon, they turned their eyes toward Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago, recognizing the wealth of these regions in terms of trade, natural resources, and strategic coastal strongholds. For centuries, Spain sought not only to conquer, but also to Christianize the populations of Mindanao, bringing them under the crown and the Catholic Church. The Kolibugan found themselves caught in the middle of these imperial ambitions. Their coastal settlements in Zamboanga were precisely the kinds of areas that Spanish forces targeted for military forts, missions, and resettlements. In 1635, Spain established Fort Pilar in Zamboanga City as a strategic base to launch campaigns against the Moro sultanates. This became a flashpoint in the centuries-long Moro Wars, a series of conflict between Spanish colonizers and Muslim groups who resisted conversion and colonization. For the Kolibugan, the situation was deeply complicated. On one hand, there were Muslims, at least nominally. and thus viewed by the Spanish as part of the Moro world that needed to be subdued. On the other hand, they were still Subanen in ancestry, and some upland relatives even came under Spanish missions. This dual heritage meant that Kolibugan communities were pressured from both directions, by Spanish attempts to colonize and by the Sultanate's expectations of loyalty in resisting Spain. Spanish campaigns often brought violence to Kolibugan communities. Slave raids, retaliatory attacks, and scorched earth tactics left villages devastated. Some Kolibugan were captured and forcibly relocated into reductions, settlements where they were taught Catholicism and subjected to colonial control. Others fled inland, seeking refuge with Subanen kin who lived farther from Spanish reach. Still, many remained loyal to the Sultanates, joining Moro resistance efforts against Spanish intrusions. The Moro Wars thus became a defining crucible for Kolibugan identity. Their survival required constant negotiation, shifting alliances, and resilience. Unlike larger groups with unified armies, the Kolibugan survived by being flexible, sometimes aligning with Muslim raiders, sometimes retreating to Subanen roots, and sometimes reluctantly accommodating Spanish power. It was this adaptability that allowed them to persist through centuries of colonial conflict. At the same time, the Kolibugan were also drawn into the resistance networks of the Sultanates. Tazig and Maguindanao raiders often attacked Spanish forts in Zamboanga, and Kolibugan warriors sometimes joined them, fighting to preserve their autonomy. For these fighters, the defense of Islam was intertwined with the defense of ancestral land and tradition. To fight against Spain was not just to defend religion, but also to safeguard their identity as a people shaped by rivers, kinship, and blended heritage. This resistance was costly. Spanish counterattacks often targeted entire villages, burning fields and enslaving inhabitants. Many Kolibugan communities shrank in size or relocated to avoid conflict. Yet, the persistence of their rituals, language, and hybrid practices during this era is a testament to their resilience. The Kolibugan refused to be erased, even under the most intense colonial pressure. Survival during the Spanish colonial era required ingenuity, adaptability, and a willingness to navigate multiple, sometimes contradictory, worlds. The Kolibugan, positioned between the Subanen uplands and the Moro sultanates, developed survival strategies that allowed them to endure despite being constantly caught in the crossfire. One such strategy was mobility. Kolibugan communities often shifted settlements, abandoning vulnerable coastal villages and moving upriver or inland when Spanish campaigns intensified. This fluidity prevented total annihilation and allowed them to re-establish themselves in safer areas. The river systems, long central to their way of life, became escape routes as well as trade corridors, enabling them to retreat and return as needed. Another strategy was selective alliance. Kolibugan leaders skillfully balanced relationships with both Moro powers and Spanish authorities. Some villages paid tribute to the sultanates, while simultaneously negotiating with Spanish officials for trade access or peace. Others entered temporary truces with the Spanish, only to rejoin Moro raids when political winds shifted. This pragmatic approach frustrated outsiders, who often accused the Kolibugan of being unreliable or duplicitous. In truth, it was a survival mechanism in a landscape where rigid loyalty could mean destruction. Cultural resilience was perhaps the most powerful survival strategy. Despite missionary pressure, Kolibugan households continued to pass down oral traditions, perform rituals, and teach their children both Subanen customs and Islamic practices. Language became a tool of preservation. Their dialect of Subanen, infused with Arabic and Malay loanwords, carried the memory of their hybrid identity. Even as Spanish documents labeled them as Indios or Moros, the Kolibugan defined themselves on their own terms, sustaining the balance between their two heritages. By the late 19th century, as Spanish colonial power weakened and revolutionary movements stirred across the Philippines, the Kolibugan had endured more than 2 centuries of conflict, displacement, and pressure. They had neither been fully colonized nor fully absorbed into the sultanates. Instead, they had carved out a precarious but resilient existence, maintaining their cultural distinctiveness against all odds. This resilience would prepare them for the next chapter of their history, the arrival of American colonization and the profound transformations of the 20th century. The dawn of the 20th century brought another colonial power into the lives of the Kolibugan, the United States of America. Following the Spanish-American War of 1898 and the subsequent Treaty of Paris, Spain ceded control of the Philippines to the United States. For the Kolibugan and other Moro groups in Mindanao, this shift did not mean liberation, but rather the beginning of a new chapter of foreign domination. The Americans, with their more modern military technology and their rhetoric of benevolent assimilation, sought to pacify and integrate Mindanao into the larger framework of the Philippine colony. In 1899, the Americans established the Moro province, encompassing Mindanao and Sulu. Unlike the Spanish, who relied heavily on Catholic missions and military forts, the Americans attempted a more systematic approach, blending military governance with civilian administration. They introduced public schools, infrastructure projects, and a new legal system, while simultaneously waging military campaigns against resistant Moro groups. For the Kolibugan, this period was both an opportunity and a threat. On one hand, the Americans reduced the intensity of direct conflict compared to the Spanish era. They pursued treaties with Moro leaders and sought to minimize large-scale violence through negotiation. Some Kolibugan villages found temporary peace in this new order, benefiting from roads, schools, and access to markets. For the first time, Kolibugan children encountered a Western-style education, where they were taught English, arithmetic, and American civic ideals. On the other hand, the new administration introduced profound challenges. The American system of governance, centralized authority, weakening traditional structures such as the Timue. While Americans sometimes recognized local chiefs, they increasingly imposed municipal governments modeled after U.S. systems. This undermined indigenous leadership and reshaped power dynamics within Kolibugan communities. Furthermore, the American military presence, though less brutal than Spanish campaigns, was still coercive. Resistance was met with force, and entire villages could be punished if suspected of harboring rebels. The Kolibugan, already accustomed to navigating between sultanates and colonizers, now had to adjust to this new foreign authority. They developed strategies of accommodation, sending representatives to schools and municipal councils while quietly preserving their Subanen Islamic traditions in the background. The arrival of American power did not erase their hybrid identity. Rather, it forced them to adapt once again, adding yet another layer to their complex cultural survival. Perhaps the most profound and lasting impact of American colonization on the Kolibugan was the question of land. For centuries, Subanen and Kolibugan communities had relied on rivers, forests, and swidden fields for sustenance. Land was not privately owned in the Western sense. It was communal, tied to kinship and spiritual guardianship. The Americans, however, introduced a radically different system: private property, legal titles, and cadastral surveys. Through laws such as the Public Land Act of 1903, the American colonial government declared much of Mindanao's land as public domain. available for homesteading, sale, or lease. This system ignored indigenous claims that were not backed by Western-style legal documents. For the Kolibugan, who relied on oral tradition and communal tenure, this meant that vast portions of their ancestral lands were suddenly reclassified as state property. The consequences were devastating. Logging companies, mining firms, and settlers from Luzon and the Visayas began to encroach on Kolibugan territories. Rivers that had once been the lifeline of their culture were diverted or polluted, and fertile valleys were transformed into plantations. While some Kolibugan families managed to secure land titles, many lacked the literacy, resources, or political influence to navigate the bureaucratic system. Gradually, dispossession spread across their communities, forcing them into marginal upland areas or turning them into laborers on lands that once belonged to their ancestors. This struggle for land was not merely economic. It was spiritual and cultural. Losing access to rivers, forests, and mountains meant severing ties with the spirits that had long been honored in Kolibugan traditions. Rituals tied to planting cycles, water spirits, and forest guardians became harder to perform as ancestral lands were taken over by outsiders. Even as Kolibugan embraced Islam more deeply during this era, their Subanen spiritual foundations remained tied to the land. The dispossession, therefore, was experienced not only as material loss, but also as cultural trauma. The American emphasis on land privatization also deepened divisions between the Kolibugan and their upland Subanen kin. Some upland groups resisted settlers fiercely, while coastal Kolibugan, more integrated into administrative systems, sometimes attempted to navigate the new order through partial accommodation. This further crystallized the Kolibugan's distinct identity as people who balanced two worlds, indigenous roots and external systems of governance. The scars of these land policies remain visible today, as many Kolibugan communities continue to struggle for ancestral domain recognition in the face of ongoing mining and logging concessions. Another major force of transformation during the American period was the spread of public education and the intensification of religious encounters. The Americans prided themselves on establishing a secular school system across the Philippines. For the Kolibugan, this meant that children, often for the first time, attended classrooms where instruction was given in English and subjects such as geography, history, and arithmetic were taught. While literacy and numeracy offered new opportunities, the curriculum also carried hidden consequences. It promoted American values and Filipino national identity while sidelining indigenous and Islamic traditions. Kolibugan children grew up reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the U.S. flag and learning about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, even as their parents continued to perform rituals to river spirits or recite Quranic verses at home. This created generational tensions. Elders feared that the younger generation would abandon ancestral customs in favor of foreign ways, while children, often fascinated by modern schooling, began to imagine futures that stretched beyond their villages. Religion also remained a contested space. Protestant missionaries, encouraged by the Americans, established missions in Mindanao, seeking to convert both Muslims and indigenous peoples. Catholic missions, reinvigorated after centuries of struggle, also pushed deeper into the peninsula. The Kolibugan, however, largely resisted these efforts, reaffirming their Islamic ties, even while maintaining elements of Subanen spirituality. For many, Islam became a symbol of identity and resistance against the encroachment of both Christianity and colonial domination. Mosques were rebuilt or expanded, Quranic teachers were invited, and Islamic rituals became more central to community life, even if syncretic practices persisted. This period also marked subtle cultural shifts. clothing styles began to incorporate Western fabrics, but woven Subanen patterns persisted in ceremonial garments. Music and oral traditions adapted to new instruments introduced through trade and colonial contact. Even language absorbed English loanwords, while retaining Subanen grammar and Islamic vocabulary. The result was an even more layered cultural identity. Kolibugan children could converse in Subanen dialects at home, recite Arabic prayers in the mosque, and write in English at school, a trilingual reality that reflected their hybrid world. By the end of the American colonial period, the Kolibugan had undergone immense transformation. They had lost large portions of their ancestral lands, integrated aspects of Western education, and reaffirmed their Islamic identity in response to missionary pressure. Yet, through it all, they preserved their uniqueness as a community rooted in Subanen ancestry and Islamic faith, resilient in the face of colonial disruption. Their history in this era is not one of disappearance, but of adaptation, ensuring that their story would continue into the tumultuous decades of independence and nation-building that followed. When World War II erupted in the Pacific in 1941, the Kolibugan, like many other communities in Mindanao, were suddenly thrust into the violent currents of global conflict. The Japanese invasion of the Philippines did not spare the southern islands. By early 1942, Japanese forces occupied key coastal towns in Zamboanga and Basilan, aiming to secure vital resources and strategic positions. The Kolibugan, scattered across coastal and riverine settlements of Zamboanga del Norte and Zamboanga del Sur, found themselves caught between the occupying Japanese military and the emerging resistance movements. The Japanese occupation introduced unprecedented disruption to Kolibugan life. Soldiers commandeered food supplies, seized fishing boats, and conscripted villagers for forced labor. Coastal settlements were particularly vulnerable, as Japanese garrisons established outposts to monitor maritime movements. For the Kolibugan, whose livelihood depended on farming, fishing, and small-scale trade, this meant the constant threat of hunger and displacement. The fertile valleys and rivers that had long sustained them became contested spaces where raids, ambushes, and skirmishes took place. Yet, the Kolibugan did not passively endure occupation. Many villages provided covert support to the anti-Japanese guerrilla forces that arose in Mindanao. These guerrillas were a mix of Filipino soldiers, Moro fighters, and even American officers who refused to surrender after the fall of Bataan. Kolibugan men contributed knowledge of terrain and waterways, guiding guerrilla units through forests and rivers that outsiders found difficult to navigate. Women played crucial roles as well, hiding food supplies, transmitting messages, and caring for wounded fighters. At the same time, the Kolibugan's hybrid identity placed them in a delicate position. Their Islamic ties connected them to Moro groups who fiercely resisted Japanese occupation, often mounting armed resistance. Their Subanen ancestry, however, meant they also maintained kinship ties with upland communities that tried to remain neutral or survive quietly under Japanese rule. This duality forced the Kolibugan to constantly negotiate their place in the conflict, balancing survival with resistance. By the time Allied forces returned in 1945, the Zamboanga Peninsula had been scarred by war. Many Kolibugan villages were burned, rice fields left fallow, and fishing disrupted. Yet, their participation in resistance also instilled a renewed sense of solidarity and identity. Having fought alongside both Moro and Filipino guerrillas, the Kolibugan emerged from the war with a stronger consciousness of belonging to a broader struggle for freedom, one that would shape their post-war aspirations. The end of the war brought liberation, but not immediate peace. The Kolibugan, like many communities in Mindanao, faced the daunting task of rebuilding lives shattered by years of occupation. Villages that had been razed had to be reconstructed from scratch, rice paddies replanted, and fishing boats repaired. Families who had lost members to Japanese reprisals or guerrilla fighting had to rebuild kinship networks, leaning on the resilience of extended families and communal labor. The Philippine Republic, newly independent in 1946, promised a new era of freedom and development. For the Kalibugan, however, this new nation-state presented both opportunities and challenges. Government programs for reconstruction often prioritized urban centers and Christian-majority areas, leaving many indigenous and Moro communities neglected. Infrastructure such as schools, roads, and clinics expanded in some areas of Zamboanga, but Kolibugan settlements in more remote coastal or riverine zones remained underserved. Land once again emerged as the central issue. The post-war government encouraged resettlement programs that brought waves of migrants from Luzon and the Visayas into Mindanao. These settlers, supported by government homestead policies, occupied lands that had historically belonged to Subanen and Kolibugan communities. Without formal land titles, the Kolibugan were unable to defend their ancestral territories against encroachment. Conflicts over land ownership intensified, sometimes erupting into violence between settlers and indigenous groups. Culturally, the post-war period also accelerated pressures on Kolibugan identity. Schools promoted a strong Filipino national identity rooted in Christian and Tagalog cultural frameworks. This often marginalized indigenous languages and Islamic practices. Young Kolibugan who attended these schools found themselves learning about Rizal and Bonifacio, but not about their own ancestors or the Buklog ritual. Parents feared that their children would grow ashamed of their heritage, seeing it as backward compared to the modernizing ideals of the new republic. Despite these pressures, the Kolibugan demonstrated remarkable adaptability. They rebuilt their mosques, revived Islamic practices disrupted by the war, and continued to perform ancestral rituals in private. Community leaders also began to engage with emerging indigenous rights movements, seeking recognition of their dual heritage as both Subanen descendants and Muslim Filipinos. The war had taught them the value of solidarity, and in the Reconstruction period, this solidarity was channeled into efforts to defend their culture, land, and identity within the new Philippine state. The post-war decades marked a critical moment in the evolution of Kolibugan identity. Having survived the war, they now faced the long-term challenge of asserting themselves in a republic dominated by lowland Christian Filipinos. The Kolibugan's position as an Islamized Subanen subgroup placed them in a unique but precarious space. They were often viewed by mainstream society as Moros and lumped together with other Muslim groups, while among Moro communities, they were sometimes seen as less orthodox, still too rooted in animistic Subanen traditions. This marginal status pushed the Kolibugan to redefine their sense of self. For many, Islam became a central marker of identity, serving as both a spiritual anchor and a political shield against assimilation. The construction of mosques and the teaching of Quranic schools became more systematic, reflecting broader Islamic renewal movements across Mindanao. At the same time, cultural practices like the Buklog continued, though increasingly performed in private or framed as cultural rather than religious traditions. This delicate balancing act allowed the Kolibugan to remain rooted in their Subanen heritage while asserting their Muslim identity in a post-war world where religion and politics were deeply intertwined. The political landscape of Mindanao during this era also shaped Kolibugan consciousness. The influx of settlers and the marginalization of indigenous peoples led to the rise of political activism among both Moro and Lumad, non-Islamized indigenous communities. The Kolibugan found themselves at the crossroads of these movements, sharing grievances over land dispossession with their Subanen kin, while aligning religiously with Moro struggles for recognition and autonomy. This duality positioned them uniquely within the broader narrative of Mindanao's post-war politics. Leaders from Kolibugan communities began to participate more actively in local governance, sometimes securing positions in municipal councils or barangay leadership. However, representation at higher levels remained limited, as political power was dominated by settler elites and established Moro dynasties. Still, these early steps into political participation laid the groundwork for later involvement in indigenous and Moro advocacy movements that would gain strength in the latter half of the 20th century. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Kalibugan were no longer merely surviving. They were redefining themselves. Their experiences in World War II had taught them the necessity of resilience and adaptability, while post-war reconstruction exposed them to the inequities of the Philippine nation-state. In response, they cultivated a stronger sense of identity that embraced both Subanen roots and Islamic faith, asserting their distinctiveness in a world that often sought to categorize them as either just Subanen or just Moro. Their hybrid heritage was not a weakness but a source of strength, allowing them to navigate multiple worlds and prepare for the struggles of the coming decades, when Mindanao would once again become the center of conflict and resistance. By the late 1960s, Mindanao was on the brink of eruption. Decades of migration from Luzon and the Visayas, encouraged by government land policies, had displaced countless indigenous and Moro communities from their ancestral lands. The Kalibugan, who already suffered from dispossession during the American and post-war periods, now faced an even more aggressive wave of land grabbing and demographic change. Settler populations expanded rapidly in Zamboanga del Norte and Zamboanga del Sur, often backed by political patrons, logging companies, and military protection. Kolibugan villages, dependent on rivers and coastal zones, found themselves increasingly pushed into marginal uplands or forced to negotiate tenancy on land that once was theirs. Amid these tensions, the Moro rebellion emerged, sparked by the infamous Jabita massacre of 1968, in which Muslim trainees were allegedly executed by the Philippine military. Moro leaders and youth began organizing armed resistance. By the early 1970s, groups like the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, led by Nur Miswari, rose to prominence, demanding independence for the Bangsamoro homeland. For the Kolibugan, this struggle resonated deeply. Their Islamic faith and historical ties to the sultanates bound them to the Moro cause. Yet their Subanen roots also tied them to indigenous Lumad struggles for land and recognition. When the MNLF began mobilizing across Mindanao, Kolibugan communities along Sibugay Bay and the Zamboanga Peninsula were drawn into the conflict. Some Kolibugan youths joined the MNLF ranks, fighting alongside Tazig, Maguindanan, and Maranao rebels. They carried weapons into forests they knew intimately, using ancestral knowledge of terrain to stage ambushes against government forces. Others provided logistical support, food, shelter, intelligence, ensuring that the rebellion could sustain itself in contested areas. However, not all Kolibugan embraced the armed struggle. Some feared the consequences of open rebellion, recalling the devastation of the Spanish and Japanese wars. Others preferred to align cautiously with the state, seeking to protect their villages from retaliation. This divergence reflected the Kolibugan's hybrid identity, tied to both Moro struggles for autonomy and Lumad struggles for survival, but always conscious of the need to adapt. The Moro rebellion thus intensified the Kolibugan's political consciousness. They were no longer passive observers of history. They were active participants in one of the largest resistance movements in Philippine history. The years ahead, however, would test their endurance like never before. as martial law unleashed new waves of violence upon their communities. In 1972, President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law, ushering in one of the darkest chapters in Philippine history. For Mindanao, the effects were especially brutal. The government launched large-scale military campaigns to suppress the MNLF and other resistance groups. Soldiers were deployed in massive numbers, and entire communities were branded as rebel sympathizers. For the Kolibugan, whose villages were often located near MNLF strongholds, martial law meant constant fear, displacement, and the collapse of normal life. Checkpoints, curfews, and military patrols became daily realities. Kolibugan men were often rounded up and interrogated, suspected of being rebels simply because of their Muslim identity. Women were subjected to harassment, and cases of abuse by soldiers were whispered in villages but rarely spoken openly for fear of reprisal. Entire settlements were burned in hamleting operations designed to isolate rebels from civilian support. Those who fled became internal refugees, carrying their children, livestock, and few possessions into the forest, where they built makeshift shelters in constant flight from both rebels and soldiers. Militarization also fractured Kolibugan society. Some youths were drawn deeper into the MNLF, radicalized by the injustices they witnessed. Others were recruited into government-sponsored paramilitary groups, such as the Civilian Home Defense Forces, CHDF, in exchange for protection or material benefits. These divisions often pitted Kolibugan against Kolibugan, tearing apart kinship ties and leaving deep scars in community life. Amid the violence, ancestral rituals and cultural practices were disrupted. The bucklog could not be performed in villages constantly under threat of attack. Agricultural cycles were broken, with swidden fields abandoned and rice harvest destroyed. Rivers that had once symbolized life became boundaries of conflict, where ambushes and firefights frequently occurred. The cultural heart of the Kolibugan, the delicate balance of Subanen traditions and Islamic faith, was strained by the relentless violence of martial law. Yet, resilience persisted. Some communities secretly maintained rituals, performing them in forest clearings or hidden valleys. Elders continued to tell stories to children at night, reminding them of their ancestry and identity. The Kolibugan adapted once again, finding ways to preserve fragments of their heritage even as they endured the terror of militarization. The 1970s and 1980s were not only a time of violence, but also of profound political awakening for the Kolibugan. As martial law dragged on, they realized that their struggles for survival were part of larger currents sweeping across Mindanao and the Philippines. The Moro rebellion framed their Islamic faith as part of a broader struggle for Bangsamoro self-determination, while Lumad movements highlighted the shared plight of indigenous peoples facing land dispossession and militarization. For many Kolibugan, this dual awareness crystallized into a clearer sense of their unique identity. They were not simply Moros, nor simply Lumad. They were both, and neither. Their identity as Kolibugan meant embracing hybridity as strength. In the midst of martial law, some leaders began articulating this uniqueness, insisting that the Kolibugan deserve recognition not as a minor subgroup, but as a distinct people with their own culture, history, and aspirations. At the grassroots level, political consciousness grew. Young Kolibugan who survived displacement began to organize, sometimes joining Moro movements, sometimes Lumad organizations, and sometimes church-led NGOs advocating for indigenous rights. These networks exposed them to ideas of social justice, human rights, and self-determination. For the first time, Kolibugan leaders began to speak in national forums, drawing attention to the plight of their people in Zamboanga's coastal and riverine areas. The fall of Marcos in 1986 and the restoration of democracy under Corazon Aquino offered a brief moment of hope. The peace talks between the MNLF and the Philippine government opened new possibilities for autonomy in Muslim Mindanao. For the Kalibugan, this was both promising and uncertain. Would they be recognized as part of the Bangsamoro, or would they be left in the margins once again, overshadowed by larger Moro and Lumad groups? Despite the uncertainties, the martial law years forged an enduring legacy. The Kolibugan had endured another cycle of violence, but had emerged with stronger political awareness. Their survival had depended on flexibility, but their future would require something more: assertion of their rightful place in Mindanao's evolving political landscape. The seeds of this assertion, planted in the crucible of the 1970s, 1980s, would bear fruit in the decades ahead as indigenous and Moro rights movements gain momentum. The fall of Ferdinand Marcos in 1986 and the restoration of democracy under President Corazon Aquino marked a turning point in Philippine history. For the Kalibugan, who had endured the terror of martial law, the transition to democracy offered new opportunities and uncertainties. On one hand, the lifting of military rule meant a reduction in the constant fear of raids, curfews, and forced evacuations. On the other, the structural issues of land dispossession, cultural marginalization, and political invisibility persisted, often unaddressed by the new democratic government. One of the first developments to directly affect the Kalibugan was the peace process initiated between the government and the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF. In 1989, the Philippine Congress created the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, ARMM, intended to give Moro peoples greater control over their affairs. However, the ARMM initially covered only 4 provinces, leaving out many areas where the Kalibugan lived, such as Zamboanga del Norte and Zamboanga del Sur. This exclusion placed the Kalibugan in a liminal position once again, nominally part of the Moro struggle, but geographically and politically outside the boundaries of autonomy. At the same time, the indigenous peoples movement was gaining momentum. Lumad groups across Mindanao began asserting their rights to ancestral domains and cultural preservation. For the Kolibugan, whose Subanen ancestry connected them to Lumad identity, this movement was both relevant and complicated. They shared the grievances of land loss and cultural erasure, but their Islamic identity sometimes made it difficult to fully align with Lumad activism, which often framed itself in distinction from Moro struggles. Grassroots organizations began to emerge in Kalibugan areas during the 1990s, often supported by church-based NGOs, local universities, or development agencies. These groups focused on literacy, livelihood, and land rights, helping Kalibugan communities articulate their needs in formal political arenas. Leaders who had once been silenced during martial law now found avenues to speak in barangay councils, municipal meetings, and even regional forums. Yet, representation remained limited. Larger Moro and Lumad groups still overshadowed the Kalibugan, whose smaller numbers made them politically marginal. Despite these challenges, the democratic transition sparked hope. For the first time in decades, Kalibugan communities began to imagine futures not solely defined by survival, but by the possibility of recognition and empowerment. Whether through Moro autonomy, Lumad rights movements, or broader democratic reforms, they sought spaces to assert their unique identity in a rapidly changing Mindanao. The 1996 final peace agreement between the Philippine government and the MNLF was hailed as a historic breakthrough, ending decades of armed struggle. For many Moro communities, it promised integration into mainstream governance, economic development, and recognition of cultural identity. For the Kalibugan, however, The agreement's impact was mixed, reflecting their complex position within Mindanao's ethnic mosaic. On one hand, the peace agreement reduced armed conflict in many areas. Military campaigns lessened, checkpoints were dismantled, and opportunities for economic activities expanded. Some Kalibugan farmers were able to return to abandoned lands, rebuild mosques, and resume fishing without constant fear of military harassment. The reduction in violence allowed for a revival of cultural practices that had long been disrupted. Elders once again performed rituals tied to agricultural cycles, and oral traditions flourished in community gatherings. On the other hand, the agreement reinforced the dominance of larger Moro groups, particularly the Tausig, Maguindanao, and Maranao. The Aramim, which was expanded as part of the settlement, still did not cover most Kalibugan areas. Zamboanga Peninsula, where many Kalibugan lived, remained under the authority of the national government and settler-dominated local politics. This left Kalibugan communities marginalized from the benefits of autonomy. They were often seen as too small to warrant special recognition and too hybrid to fit neatly into the categories of either Moro or Lumad. Moreover, the agreement did little to resolve the issue of land. Agribusiness corporations and mining companies expanded their operations in Zamboanga during the late 1990s, often with the backing of local officials. Without formal ancestral domain titles, Kalibugan villages continued to lose access to rivers, forests, and farmlands. While the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997 provided a legal framework for ancestral domain claims, the Kalibugans' dual identity complicated their access to these rights. Some officials argued that, as Muslims, they fell under Moro structures rather than IPRA protections for indigenous peoples, while others dismissed their Islamic identity and treated them as ordinary settlers. This bureaucratic ambiguity left many Kalibugan claims unresolved. The 1996 peace agreement also brought new political dynamics. Former MNLF fighters were integrated into local governments, police forces, and development agencies. Some Kalibugan youths who had fought with the MNLF gained recognition, but many others were sidelined, their contributions overshadowed by larger ethnic groups. This reinforced a long-standing reality that the Kalibugan, despite their sacrifices and struggles for autonomy, often remained invisible in the outcomes of peace processes. The early 2000s were a period of both progress and uncertainty for the Kalibugan. The Philippines was navigating a complex landscape of peace talks, development programs, and renewed conflicts with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF, a splinter group from the MNLF. For the Kalibugan, these shifting dynamics once again highlighted their vulnerable position on the margins of larger political movements. One of the most significant developments of this era was the intensification of ancestral domain claims under the IPRA. Across Mindanao, Lumad groups filed petitions for certificates of ancestral domain title, CATs, seeking legal recognition of their traditional territories. For the Kalibugan, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. Their Subanen ancestry gave them a legitimate claim as indigenous peoples, but their Islamic faith complicated the process. Some Kalibugan leaders pursued CADT applications, emphasizing their Subanen roots, while others sought inclusion in Moro frameworks of autonomy. This internal debate reflected the duality of their identity. Were they better off asserting themselves as Lumad or as Moro? The rise of development projects also shaped Kalibugan life. Government and NGO programs brought livelihood assistance, health services, and education initiatives to remote areas. Yet, these programs often failed to account for the Kalibugans' unique cultural needs. Schools still prioritized national curricula, sidelining indigenous languages and histories. Livelihood projects sometimes disrupted traditional farming or fishing practices, introducing cash crops or techniques that clashed with local ecological knowledge. While some communities benefited, others felt that development was another form of cultural erasure. The persistence of armed conflict also cast a shadow. While the MNLF had signed a peace agreement, the MILF continued armed resistance, particularly in central Mindanao. Skirmishes occasionally spilled into Zamboanga, displacing Kolibugan families and forcing them into evacuation centers. The presence of armed groups, both rebels and state forces, meant that Kolibugan villages were once again suspected of being sympathizers or collaborators, echoing the suspicions of the martial law era. Despite these challenges, the Kolibugan began to find stronger voices in advocacy networks. Cultural organizations documented their history, language, and rituals, seeking recognition from the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, NCCA, and other institutions. International agencies like UNESCO also began highlighting Subanen traditions, such as the Bucklog ritual, bringing global attention to practices that Kolibugan communities had helped sustain. These recognitions were small, but significant steps toward visibility. By the end of the 2000s, the Kolibugan stood at a crossroads. They had endured centuries of colonization, war, and marginalization, yet remained resilient. The democratic transition had opened new spaces for political participation, but their hybrid identity continued to place them at the edges of both Moro and Nomad frameworks. Their challenge was clear: to assert themselves as a distinct people, neither erased by assimilation nor overshadowed by larger groups. The next decades, marked by renewed peace efforts and the creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, would test their ability to claim that space. The dawn of the 2010s brought renewed hope for lasting peace in Mindanao. After decades of intermittent negotiations and conflict, the Philippine government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF, entered into serious peace talks, facilitated by international mediators. These talks aim to resolve one of the most enduring insurgencies in Asia and to create a political framework that recognized Moro self-determination. For the Kolibugan, these developments were both promising and precarious. In 2012, the signing of the Framework Agreement on the Bangsamoro, FAB, laid the foundation for what would eventually become the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM. This agreement envisioned replacing the flawed ARMM with a more empowered autonomous government that would have greater fiscal and political powers. For many Moro communities, this was a triumph after decades of struggle. For the Kolibugan, however, the question loomed: would they be recognized within this new framework or once again left in the margins? Geographically, many Kolibugan lived outside the core territories covered by the BARMM. While the ARMM had already excluded Zamboanga Peninsula areas, the BARMM negotiations also largely focused on Maguindanao, Lanao, Basilan, Sulu, and Taytay. This meant that Kolibugan settlements in Zamboanga del Norte and Zamboanga del Sur were once again on the periphery of autonomy. The Kolibugan thus faced a familiar dilemma. Their Islamic identity tied them to the Moro struggle, but their geographic location tied them to areas governed by settler-dominated local politics. Despite this exclusion, the Kolibugan engaged actively in the peace discourse. Leaders attended consultations, workshops, and dialogues organized by NGOs, international agencies, and the Bangsamoro Transition Commission, BTC. They raised concerns that their voices were not being heard in mainstream negotiations. While larger Moro groups emphasized their distinctiveness from the Nomad, the Kolibugan highlighted their dual heritage, Islamized yet indigenous. They argued that any genuine peace process in Mindanao had to account for communities like theirs who embodied the intersection of Moro and Lumad histories. This period revealed both the resilience and vulnerability of Kolibugan identity. They were determined not to be erased in the narrative of Moro liberation, but without clear political representation in the BRMM framework, their future remained uncertain. The challenge was no longer survival in the face of war, but recognition in the halls of peace and governance. In 2014, the signing of the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro, CAB, marked the culmination of decades of negotiations. It paved the way for the drafting and passage of the Bangsamoro Organic Law, BOL, in 2018, which was ratified in 2019, officially creating the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM. This was celebrated as a historic achievement for Moro self-determination, granting the region more powers than the ARMM ever had. For many communities, it was the realization of generations of struggle. For the Kolibugan, however, the picture was more complicated. The BARM's territorial coverage once again excluded most Kolibugan areas. Provinces such as Zamboanga del Norte, Zamboanga del Sur, and coastal Sibiway Bay remained under national and regional governments outside the BARM's authority. This meant that Kolibugan communities were technically part of the Moro people recognized in the peace process, but were geographically excluded from the political entity created to empower them. The irony was not lost on Kolibugan leaders. After centuries of aligning with Moro struggles, they were once again marginalized in the outcome. Moreover, the structures of the BRMM tended to privilege the larger Moro ethno-linguistic groups, the Tazig, Maguindanan, and Maranao. While the BOL recognized the rights of non-Moro indigenous peoples, MIPS, such as the Lumad, it did not provide specific provisions for hybrid groups like the Kolibugan. This ambiguity left them in a gray area, too Moro to qualify as MIPS, yet too indigenous to be fully integrated into mainstream Moro structures. As a result, many Kolibugan communities found themselves without a clear institutional pathway for asserting their rights. At the grassroots level, this exclusion translated into ongoing struggles. Mining concessions and agribusiness projects continued to threaten Kolibugan ancestral lands, while political representation remained limited in local governments dominated by settler elites. Development programs funded by BRMM rarely reached them, as their territories fell outside its jurisdiction. NGOs and cultural advocates continued to raise the issue of Kolibugan marginalization, but the absence of formal recognition limited their ability to secure lasting solutions. Still, the creation of the BRMM inspired the Kolibugan to intensify their advocacy. Leaders began framing their struggle not only in terms of Moro identity, but also as part of the broader indigenous rights movement. They emphasized that peace in Mindanao would remain incomplete as long as groups like the Kolibugan remained invisible. In doing so, they sought to carve out a space for their voices in both Moro and Lumad discourses, refusing to let history repeat its cycle of exclusion. In the present day, the Kolibugan continue to navigate the complexities of living at the intersection of Subanen heritage and Islamic identity. The political landscape of Mindanao has shifted with the establishment of the BRMM, but the Kolibugan's challenges remain deeply rooted in issues of land, culture, and recognition. At the same time, their resilience and adaptability continue to define their story. One of the most pressing struggles is land rights. Despite the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997, many Kolibugan communities have yet to secure certificates of ancestral domain title, CADs. Bureaucratic hurdles, overlapping claims with settlers, and the ambiguity of their identity as Islamized Subanen have stalled applications. In the meantime, mining companies and agribusiness ventures have expanded into their territories, threatening rivers, forests, and fields that hold both economic and spiritual significance. This has sparked localized protests, often led by Kolibugan youth who see land defense as central to their future. Culturally, the Kolibugan face the challenge of passing on traditions to younger generations in an age of globalization. Many young people are drawn to urban centers like Zamboanga city, lured by education and employment opportunities. This migration risks weakening ties to ancestral rituals and oral traditions. Yet, cultural revival movements are also emerging. Community elders and cultural workers have begun documenting songs, dances, and oral histories, ensuring that Kolibugan heritage is not lost. The Bucklog ritual, in particular, has gained renewed visibility through recognition by UNESCO, reminding the world of the Subanen, and by extension Kolibugan, contribution to global cultural heritage. Religiously, the Kolibugan continue to navigate their duality. Islamic practices such as daily prayers, fasting during Ramadan, and Quranic education remain central, while subtle echoes of Subanen spirituality persist in rituals tied to rivers and forests. This syncretism, once criticized as impurity by outsiders, is increasingly embraced by Kolibugan communities as a symbol of resilience. For them, hybridity is not a weakness, but a testament to survival in the face of centuries of change. Today, the Kolibugan stand at a critical juncture. They are more visible than ever before in cultural discourse, yet politically marginalized. They have endured colonialism, war, martial law, and the incomplete promises of autonomy, yet they remain steadfast in their identity. Their story is a reminder that peace is not only about treaties and laws, but also about recognizing the lived realities of communities whose histories straddle multiple worlds. The Kolibugan, with their Subanen roots and Islamic faith, embody this complexity, an enduring people whose resilience continues to shape the cultural tapestry of Mindanao. In the 21st century, the Kolibugan face one of their greatest challenges: the preservation of their language and identity in the midst of modernization. Their dialect, often referred to as Kolibugan Subanen, is a living marker of their heritage. It reflects their Subanen roots while incorporating Arabic and Malay loanwords introduced through Islam. For generations, this dialect has carried not only everyday communication, but also oral histories, myths, prayers, and chants that define their cultural worldview. Yet, like many indigenous languages, it is increasingly threatened. Globalization and migration have shifted linguistic practices among younger Kolibugan. Many families now prioritize Cebuano/Bisaya, the lingua franca of Mindanao, for economic and social mobility. Others encourage the use of Tagalog/Filipino or English, which dominate education, media, and employment. As a result, Kolibugan Subanen is often spoken only by elders and in more rural villages. This generational gap raises fears that the language, along with the cultural memory it carries, could fade within decades if not actively preserved. Recognizing this, community leaders and cultural advocates have launched efforts to document and revitalize the language. Elders collaborate with NGOs and universities to record oral traditions, transcribe folktales, and develop dictionaries. Schools in some areas experiment with mother tongue-based education, teaching children to read and write in Kolibugan Subanen alongside Filipino and English. These efforts reflect a growing realization that preserving language is not just about words. It is about maintaining identity. For the Kolibugan, language preservation also connects to their dual heritage. Their dialect carries echoes of Islamic devotion through Arabic terms for prayer, fasting, and ritual, while retaining Subanen concepts tied to rivers, forests, and spirits. This hybridity is a unique strength, making their language a living archive of centuries of cultural fusion. Yet, without sustained effort, it risks being overshadowed by dominant tongues. In the 21st century, therefore, language has become a front line of cultural preservation. For the Kolibugan, speaking their dialect is not merely an act of communication. It is an act of resistance against cultural erasure, a declaration that their identity remains alive amid the pressures of modernity. Another crucial aspect of cultural preservation for the Kolibugan is the safeguarding of rituals and festivals that embody their worldview. Chief among these is the Buklog, the Subanen ceremonial ritual recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. For the Kolibugan, who inherited Subanen traditions while embracing Islam, the Buklog holds deep symbolic power. It is performed to honor spirits, mark significant life events, or seek blessings for health and prosperity. The Buklog involves constructing a large wooden platform elevated on posts. Participants dance rhythmically upon it, causing the structure to resonate with deep, booming sounds that echo through the forest. This vibration is believed to connect the human world with the spiritual realm, creating harmony between people, ancestors, and nature. For centuries, the Buklog has been a marker of Subanen identity, and the Kolibugan have preserved it as part of their cultural repertoire, even as they align with Islamic practices. In the 21st century, however, the performance of the Buklog has faced challenges. Modernization has made it more difficult to gather the resources, timber, labor, and communal participation needed to construct the ritual platform. The spread of stricter Islamic interpretations has also led some to view the ritual as un-Islamic, discouraging younger generations from participating. At the same time, government regulation of forests has limited access to materials, further complicating the ritual's continuity. Despite these obstacles, cultural revival movements have reasserted the value of the Buklog. Community organizations, supported by cultural agencies, now stage Buklog performances not only for ritual purposes, but also as cultural showcases during festivals and heritage events. While some purists worry this reduces the ritual to performance, others argue it keeps the tradition alive, especially for younger Kolibugan who otherwise might never witness it. Beyond the Buklog, other traditions such as weaving, musical performances, and oral storytelling are also being revived. Kolibugan women continue to weave patterns that symbolize ancestral motifs, while storytellers recount epics that blend Subanen myth with Islamic morality. These practices serve as cultural anchors, reminding the community of who they are even as they engage with modern education, technology, and urban migration. Through these efforts, the Kolibugan show that cultural preservation is not about freezing traditions in the past, but adapting them for the present. The Buklog and other rituals remain vital, not as relics, but as living expressions of a people navigating the 21st century while carrying the voices of their ancestors. In today's interconnected world, education and technology play paradoxical roles in Kolibugan cultural preservation. On one hand, schools and media often promote national and global cultures at the expense of local traditions. On the other, these very tools can be harnessed to preserve and transmit heritage in new ways. The Kolibugan, like many indigenous groups, now grapple with how to balance these forces. Modern education is both a challenge and an opportunity. Kolibugan children grow up learning primarily in Cebuano, Tagalog, and English, languages that connect them to the wider Philippine society but often distance them from their ancestral tongue. Curricula emphasize national heroes, Western science, and global knowledge, with little space for Kalibugan history or worldview. This creates generational gaps, where young people excel academically but struggle to connect with their cultural roots. Elders sometimes lament that children can recite the Philippine national anthem, but cannot perform a traditional chant or explain the meaning of ancestral rituals. Yet, education also equips young Kalibugan with tools to defend and revitalize their culture. College students and graduates have begun documenting oral histories, writing research papers, and producing cultural materials that highlight Kalibugan identity. Teachers in local schools, many of them Kalibugan themselves, are experimenting with incorporating folklore and language into lessons. These small steps are vital in bridging the gap between formal education and indigenous knowledge. Technology, too, has become a surprising ally. Smartphones and social media, once seen only as agents of cultural homogenization, are now used to record and share Kalibugan songs, dances, and rituals. Younger generations upload videos of elders performing chants or constructing buklaw platforms, preserving them in digital archives accessible far beyond their villages. Online platforms also connect Kalibugan youth with wider networks of indigenous and Moro advocates, fostering solidarity and shared learning. Of course, technology brings risks. Western media and global consumer culture often overshadow indigenous values, promoting lifestyles far removed from Kalibugan realities. Yet, when used intentionally, these tools can strengthen rather than weaken identity. A young Kalibugan who records her grandmother's weaving techniques on a smartphone, or who posts about Kalibugan festivals on social media, participates in a modern form of cultural preservation that bridges tradition and innovation. In the 21st century, therefore, the challenge is not whether the Kalibugan can preserve their culture, but how. By embracing education and technology while grounding themselves in ancestral traditions, they demonstrate that cultural survival is not about resisting change, but about shaping it. Their identity, forged through centuries of hybridity, remains dynamic, capable of adapting to new realities without losing its essence. For the Kalibugan, land is not merely property to be owned. It is the sacred space where identity, spirituality, and survival converge. Their Subanen ancestors long believed that rivers, forests, and mountains were animated by spirits who demanded respect and offerings. Islam, while reorienting much of their religious worldview, did not erase this deep attachment to the natural environment. Instead, it layered Islamic teachings on stewardship and community with ancestral reverence for the land. Thus, to speak of land for the Kalibugan is to speak of culture, religion, and history all at once. The Kalibugan view their ancestral domains as more than economic assets. They are living archives of memory. Each river has stories of trade. Each mountain has tales of battles or rituals, and each forest is tied to the survival of countless generations. When families plant rice or corn in shifting swidden plots, they do so with rituals invoking both Allah's blessing and ancestral spirits. When fishermen cast their nets in coastal waters, they remember the teachings of elders about sustainable harvests. Land, then, is inseparable from the moral codes that define Kalibugan life. This worldview stands in stark contrast to state policies and commercial ventures that treat land as a commodity. Philippine land laws, shaped by colonial systems, demand titles, surveys, and bureaucratic processes that ignore oral traditions and spiritual claims. For the Kalibugan, who rely on collective memory and community consent, this system is alien and exclusionary. The absence of paper titles has allowed corporations, settlers, and politicians to declare vast tracts of Kalibugan territory as public land or unused. As a result, Kalibugan communities often find themselves dispossessed. When forests are logged, rivers polluted, or fields converted into plantations, they lose not only livelihoods, but also the cultural rituals tied to those spaces. A bucklog cannot be performed if the sacred trees are gone. A wedding loses meaning if the ancestral river is dammed. The erosion of land, therefore, leads to the erosion of identity. Yet, far from surrendering, the Kalibugan continue to assert their ancestral relationship with the land through oral tradition, local governance, and increasingly legal advocacy. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen the intensification of mining and agribusiness projects in the Zamboanga Peninsula. Rich in mineral resources such as nickel, gold, and copper, the lands of the Kalibugan have long been eyed by corporations seeking profit. Government concessions, often granted without proper consultation, have handed over large swaths of ancestral territory to mining firms. Bulldozers carve into mountains, tailings pollute rivers, and forests once central to Kalibugan rituals are stripped bare. Agribusiness poses an equally profound threat. Palm oil plantations and commercial banana farms have expanded aggressively in Mindanao, often displacing small farmers. For Kalibugan communities, this means losing swidden fields and being pressured to shift from subsistence farming to wage labor. In some cases, they're offered contracts to cultivate cash crops, but these arrangements often trap them in cycles of debt and dependence. What was once a communal and sustainable relationship with land becomes a precarious struggle for survival under corporate systems. These developments are not merely economic disruptions. They cut at the cultural core of Kalibugan life. When rivers are poisoned by mining, families cannot perform rituals tied to water spirits. When forests are cleared, medicinal plants vanish, and with them the knowledge of traditional healers. When fields are taken, communities lose the autonomy to dictate their own agricultural cycles. Thus, mining and agribusiness are experienced not just as material threats, but as cultural assaults. Resistance has emerged, though often at great cost. Kalibugan leaders who speak out against mining face harassment, intimidation, or even violence from powerful interests. Some villages have organized protests, blocking roads or petitioning government agencies. Others have sought alliances with NGOs and environmental groups, framing their struggle as both an indigenous rights issue and an environmental crisis. Despite these efforts, the asymmetry of power between small communities and large corporations remains stark. Yet, resistance has planted seeds of empowerment. Younger Kalibugan activists, inspired by both indigenous advocacy and Islamic stewardship teachings, now articulate their defense of land as part of a moral duty to protect creation. In confronting mining and agribusiness, the Kalibugan reaffirm that land is not for sale because it is inseparable from who they are. The passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997 provided a legal framework for ancestral domain recognition in the Philippines. In principle, it allowed indigenous communities to apply for certificates of ancestral domain title, CATs, granting them legal ownership of their traditional lands. For many Lumad groups, this was a powerful tool for reclaiming dispossessed territories. For the Kalibugan, however, the process has been fraught with difficulties. The Kalibugan's hybrid identity complicates their legal status. As Islamized Subanen, they are often categorized as part of the Moro population rather than as Lumad. This duality means government agencies sometimes question whether they qualify under IPRA as indigenous peoples. At the same time, within Moro political structures, they're frequently marginalized as a small subgroup, overshadowed by the larger Tausig, Maguindanao, and Maranao. Thus, they fall through the cracks of both legal and political frameworks, denied the protections that should rightfully apply to them. Despite these obstacles, some Kalibugan communities have filed ancestral domain claims by emphasizing their Subanen ancestry. This requires extensive documentation of oral histories, genealogies, and ritual practices, a daunting task given limited resources and bureaucratic barriers. Elders testify about ancestral rivers and forests, while cultural workers map sacred sites. These efforts not only serve legal purposes but also strengthen internal identity, reminding communities of their deep roots. The struggle for ancestral domain is also a struggle for survival in the face of climate change and ecological degradation. Kolibugan leaders argue that granting legal recognition of their territories is not only about justice, but also about sustainability. As stewards of rivers and forests, they have maintained ecological balance for centuries. Protecting their land rights, therefore, benefits not just their communities but the environment as a whole. Yet, progress is painfully slow. Many applications remain pending for years, while mining concessions are approved in months. Frustration grows, but so does determination. The Kalibugan are learning to navigate courts, bureaucracies, and advocacy networks, refusing to let their voices be silenced. Their fight for ancestral domain is not just about reclaiming land. It is about asserting that their identity, culture, and future cannot exist without the rivers, mountains, and forests that have defined them since time immemorial. In the barangays and municipalities of the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Kalibugan participate in the daily grind of local governance, a realm where survival, negotiation, and cultural assertion often intersect. Despite being numerically smaller than neighboring Moro groups or migrant settlers from Luzon and the Visayas, Kalibugan leaders have carved spaces in local politics, typically through barangay councils, municipal boards, or traditional leadership roles that overlap with state structures. Grassroots leadership among the Kalibugan often flows from the traditional authority of the Timue, whose role has survived centuries of external pressure. While no longer the sole governing authority, the Timue continues to serve as a cultural mediator, especially in land disputes, family conflicts, and ritual obligations. In some villages, the Timue works alongside barangay captains, blending customary law with state governance. This dual authority allows the Kalibugan to preserve elements of their heritage while adapting to the Philippine political framework. Yet, Kalibugan leaders face structural disadvantages. In barangays where migrants dominate the population, elections often sideline Kalibugan candidates. Even when elected, Kalibugan officials often lack resources to push for significant development projects. Patronage politics, which favors wealthy and well-connected candidates, further disadvantages leaders from marginalized communities. Still, resilience persists. Kalibugan barangay officials focus on small but crucial projects like improving water systems, maintaining farm-to-market roads, and supporting local schools. These incremental efforts, though modest, reflect their commitment to community welfare. At the grassroots, participation in governance is not only about services, but also about identity. A Kalibugan barangay captain who advocates for the inclusion of indigenous rituals in community festivals or who supports Quranic education for children reinforces the legitimacy of Kalibugan identity in everyday political life. Through these local positions, they make visible a people too often overlooked in national narratives. Their leadership, though often constrained, ensures that Kalibugan voices remain part of the decision-making processes that shape their communities. Beyond the barangay level, the Kalibugan's visibility in national and regional politics remains limited. In the Philippine Congress, indigenous and Moro representation is often dominated by larger and more politically organized groups. Partyless systems, such as those reserved for indigenous peoples or sectoral organizations, have seldom included Kalibugan voices specifically. Instead, they're subsumed under broader categories like Lumad or Moro, which rarely capture their hybrid identity. In the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, RMM, and later the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM, the Kalibugan face a paradox. Their Islamic faith ties them to the broader Moro identity, yet their Subanen ancestry and geographic concentration in Zamboanga Peninsula, largely outside BRMM territory, leave them marginalized in its political institutions. Foreign policies often highlight the Tausig, Maguindanan, and Maranao as the primary Moro ethno-linguistic groups, while smaller groups like the Kalibugan remain in the shadows. This lack of representation has tangible consequences. Development funds, political appointments, and cultural programs are frequently distributed in ways that benefit larger groups, leaving Kalibugan communities with limited access. For example, livelihood programs designed for Moro farmers may not reach Kalibugan villages, while IPR-related projects for Lumad communities may exclude Kalibugan because of their Islamic faith. In this bureaucratic no man's land, their voices are diluted and their needs often ignored. Despite this, advocacy networks have emerged. Kalibugan youth, scholars, and cultural workers now participate in NGOs and people's organizations that lobby for greater inclusion. They attend dialogues on indigenous rights, interfaith forums, and peace-building workshops, ensuring that Kalibugan perspectives are heard. Some have also entered academia, producing research and publications that highlight Kalibugan histories and struggles, thereby increasing their visibility. Still, the struggle for genuine political representation continues. Without dedicated seats or recognition within existing political frameworks, the Kalibugan risk being continually sidelined. Their challenge is not only to demand inclusion, but also to assert their distinctiveness in systems that prefer clear categories of Moro or Lumad. In this, their hybridity, once a source of marginalization, can also become a strength, positioning them as mediators in the complex landscape of Mindanao politics. In the 21st century, the Kalibugan are cultivating a new political consciousness that transcends survival and demands recognition. This awakening is driven by younger generations who, educated in schools and exposed to wider political discourses, see their community not merely as passive participants, but as rightful claimants to justice, rights, and representation. This consciousness blends indigenous identity, Islamic faith, and democratic ideals in ways that reflect their hybrid history. Kalibugan youth organizations now play a crucial role in advocacy. They organize cultural workshops, produce multimedia campaigns, and participate in protests against mining and land grabbing. Through social media, they amplify their voices far beyond their villages, connecting with indigenous and Moro activists across Mindanao and even internationally. In these spaces, they framed their struggles not as isolated local issues, but as part of global conversations on indigenous rights, environmental justice, and minority representation. Religious identity also shapes this consciousness. Many Kalibugan embrace Islam as both a spiritual anchor and a political identity, linking themselves to the broader Bangsamoro struggle. Yet, they also insist on their Subanen roots, highlighting rituals, languages, and traditions that distinguish them from larger Moro groups. This dual assertion challenges simplistic labels and forces recognition of their uniqueness. For them, Political advocacy is not about choosing between being Moro or Lumad, but about being both. A bridge community whose experiences embody the complexities of Mindanao. Kolibugan women have also emerged as leaders in advocacy, breaking traditional gender roles by speaking in forums, leading protests, and championing education for girls. Their involvement underscores the dynamic nature of Kolibugan political life, where resilience and adaptability extend across generations and genders. By asserting their voices, women ensure that cultural preservation and political advocacy are inclusive and forward-looking. The Kolibugan's emerging political consciousness reflects a broader lesson, that marginalization breeds not silence, but assertion. Having endured centuries of exclusion, they now demand visibility and agency. Their advocacy is not limited to formal politics. It extends into cultural preservation, environmental defense, and interfaith solidarity. In this sense, politics for the Kolibugan is not confined to elections or councils. It is woven into the very fabric of their struggle for recognition and survival. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, migration had become a defining feature of Philippine society. Millions of Filipinos left their home provinces to seek work in Manila, Cebu, and abroad as overseas Filipino workers, OFWs. The Kolibugan, like many marginalized groups in Mindanao, joined this great wave of movement. Economic pressures, land dispossession, and limited local opportunities pushed many Kolibugan to seek livelihoods far from their ancestral rivers and coasts. Young men often left to work as fishermen, construction laborers, or security guards in Zamboanga City, Davao, and other urban centers. Young women found employment as domestic helpers, sales clerks, or caregivers, some in cities within the Philippines and others overseas in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. The migration of Kolibugan women to Muslim-majority countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Malaysia carried a unique resonance. They encountered global Islam directly, often deepening their religious identity while navigating the challenges of displacement. This migration brought both opportunities and risks. On one hand, remittances provided crucial lifelines for families back home, funding education, small businesses, and even the rebuilding of mosques. Migration exposed Kolibugan workers to new skills, languages, and global perspectives, expanding their horizons beyond the confines of marginalized villages. On the other hand, migration also fractured families, with children growing up without one or both parents. Exploitation, abuse, and discrimination were common, especially for women in domestic work and men in low-wage labor. Despite these challenges, migration became a catalyst for cultural transformation. OFWs returned with stories of life abroad, sometimes with stricter Islamic practices influenced by global currents, sometimes with hybrid perspectives shaped by multicultural environments. They brought back not only money, but also new ways of thinking about identity, faith, and belonging. In this sense, diaspora life did not weaken Kolibugan identity. It reshaped it, connecting their local struggles with global flows of labor and culture. As migration intensified, informal Kolibugan diaspora communities began to emerge, particularly in cities with strong Moro populations. In Zamboanga City, for instance, Kolibugan migrants often clustered in coastal barangays where Tazig, Sama, and other Muslim groups also resided. This created spaces of solidarity, where Islamic practices could be maintained collectively, while Subanen-rooted traditions persisted in family gatherings and rituals. In urban environments, the Kolibugan learned to adapt, practicing their faith in small masjids, forming associations for mutual aid, and organizing community events that recreated the sense of belonging found in ancestral villages. Abroad, especially in the Middle East and Malaysia, Kalibugan workers often blended into broader Filipino Muslim networks. They joined Friday prayers in migrant worker mosques, celebrated Eid with fellow OFWs, and participated in Islamic classes. Yet, within these larger communities, they maintained subtle markers of distinctiveness. Kalibugan food traditions, dialectal expressions, and ritual songs often surfaced in private gatherings, where they reminded one another of home. These moments of cultural assertion ensured that their hybrid heritage was not lost in the anonymity of global migration. Cultural adaptation also meant negotiating identity. In global Muslim contexts, Kalibugan migrants sometimes downplayed their Subanen heritage, identifying primarily as Muslims to gain acceptance in religiously homogenous spaces. At other times, they emphasized their indigenous roots when connecting with international NGOs or advocacy groups focused on indigenous rights. This flexibility mirrored their long history of navigating multiple identities in Mindanao. Technology further supported diaspora connections. Social media platforms allowed Kalibugan abroad to stay in touch with family, watch Bucklog performances via video, and even participate in online discussions about ancestral land struggles. Through Facebook groups, chat apps, and video calls, diaspora workers remained emotionally anchored to their communities despite physical distance. In some cases, diaspora networks raised funds for local projects, from mosque repairs to scholarships, showing that migration did not sever ties, but transformed them into transnational lifelines. Thus, diaspora life became not an erasure of Kalibugan identity, but an expansion of it. Living in Manila, Riyadh, or Kuala Lumpur, the Kalibugan carried with them the dual heritage of Subanen and Islam, embodying it in new ways as they moved through global landscapes. In recent decades, globalization has created not only new economic realities, but also new arenas of visibility. Indigenous peoples and minority groups worldwide have found platforms in international organizations, academic research, and human rights networks. For the Kalibugan, this global stage has provided both recognition and challenges. International bodies such as UNESCO and the United Nations have highlighted the struggles of indigenous peoples in the Philippines, particularly in Mindanao. The Bucklog ritual, celebrated by the Subanen and preserved also by Kalibugan communities, was recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. While this recognition was not exclusive to the Kalibugan, it amplified their visibility on a global scale, placing their traditions within the broader narrative of humanity's cultural treasures. Such recognition also strengthened local advocacy, giving Kalibugan leaders leverage in demanding protection for cultural practices threatened by mining and modernization. At the same time, international NGOs focusing on indigenous rights have opened new spaces for Kalibugan voices. Leaders have participated in conferences on ancestral domain, environmental defense, and interfaith dialogue, presenting their community's story alongside those of other marginalized peoples from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These encounters have broadened Kalibugan perspectives, situating their struggles not just as local or national issues, but as part of global movements for justice. Yet, global recognition also brings dilemmas. To be visible internationally often requires simplifying identity into categories that outsiders can understand: indigenous, Muslim, or minority. For the Kalibugan, whose identity is precisely about hybridity, this simplification risks erasing complexity. Some leaders therefore emphasize being Islamized Subanen, insisting that hybridity itself deserves recognition. Others strategically adopt broader labels when engaging with international platforms, knowing that visibility sometimes requires compromise. Ultimately, diaspora and global recognition have expanded the Kolibugan's horizons. No longer confined to rivers and coasts of Zamboanga, their voices now echo in conferences, social media, and transnational networks. Their challenge is to ensure that these new forms of visibility translate into tangible gains for communities still struggling with land dispossession, cultural erosion, and political marginalization. Global recognition alone is not enough. It must be harnessed in a local empowerment. The Kolibugan's relationship with larger Moro groups, Tazig, Maguindanao, Maranao, and Sama, has always been complex, marked by both kinship and tension. Historically, the Kolibugan were drawn into the Moro world through intermarriage, trade, and Islamization. Their identity as Islamized Subanen placed them within the broader Bangsamoro cultural sphere, yet their Subanen roots distinguish them from other Muslim ethno-linguistic groups. In modern times, this duality continues to shape their interactions with Moro neighbors. On the one hand, the Kolibugan benefit from solidarity with Moro communities. Shared Islamic practices such as Friday prayers, Ramadan fasting, and Eid celebrations foster a sense of belonging. In cities like Zamboanga and Pagadian, Kolibugan Muslims integrate into Moro mosques and join broader Islamic organizations, where they are recognized as part of the Ummah. In times of political struggle, particularly during the Moro rebellion and peace processes, Kolibugan leaders often aligned with Moro fronts, framing their own struggles as part of the wider Bangsamoro narrative. On the other hand, tensions arise because of cultural and political marginalization. Within Moro-majority spaces, Kolibugan are sometimes seen as less orthodox or even half-Muslims due to their retention of Subanen traditions such as the bucklog. Moro elites, who dominate regional politics and religious institutions, rarely prioritize Kolibugan concerns, focusing instead on the larger ethno-linguistic blocks. This marginalization reinforces feelings of invisibility. While included in the idea of Bangsamoro, Kolibugan voices are rarely at the center of decision-making. Nevertheless, the Kolibugan have carved niches of influence in Moro contexts. They serve as cultural mediators, bridging the gap between indigenous Lumad groups and Moro organizations. Their hybrid heritage gives them credibility in both worlds, allowing them to negotiate peace-building initiatives or inter-community disputes. In this way, their relationship with Moro communities is not one of dependency, but of interdependence. While overshadowed politically, they provide unique cultural and diplomatic value that enriches the fabric of Bangsamoro identity. The Kolibugan's Subanen roots connect them to the broader family of Lumad peoples in Mindanao, such as the Manobo, Higanon, and Bland. These connections are often expressed through shared rituals, agricultural practices, and ecological worldviews. For example, like other Lumad, the Kolibugan recognize the spirits of rivers, forests, and mountains, even as their Islamic identity reshapes these beliefs into forms compatible with monotheism. This kinship is not only cultural, but also political, as both Lumad and Kolibugan face issues of land dispossession, resource exploitation, and political exclusion. In the 21st century, indigenous advocacy networks have gained prominence, demanding recognition of ancestral domains and cultural rights. Here, the Kolibugan find both opportunities and challenges. On one side, their Subanen ancestry gives them legitimate claims within Lumad advocacy. They share with other indigenous peoples the struggle for land, the defense of rivers and forests, and the preservation of oral traditions. Kolibugan leaders often join Lumad-led protests against mining, logging, and militarization, recognizing their common cause. On the other side, their Islamic identity sometimes complicates solidarity. Some Lumad organizations, wary of Moro dominance in Mindanao politics, distinguished themselves from Muslim groups. In such contexts, Kolibugan participants must carefully assert their dual heritage, reminding allies that their struggles overlap without being identical. This delicate positioning requires diplomatic skill, balancing solidarity with the assertion of uniqueness. Despite these complexities, inter-indigenous relations remain a powerful avenue for Kolibugan empowerment. By participating in Lumad advocacy, they broaden their visibility beyond the Bangsamoro framework, aligning themselves with global indigenous movements recognized by institutions such as the UN and UNESCO. In these spaces, their Subanen roots are foreground, showing the world that the Kolibugan are not simply an appendage of Moro identity, but a distinct community bridging two traditions. Through these connections, the Kolibugan reinforce their legitimacy as indigenous people while maintaining their Islamic faith. This balancing act, while challenging, also empowers them. They can claim rights under both indigenous and Moro frameworks, ensuring that their duality becomes a source of strength rather than marginalization. Perhaps the most complex and historically fraught relationship the Kolibugan have navigated is with Christian settlers, who began arriving in large numbers during the American colonial period and intensified after World War II through government-sponsored resettlement programs. Migrants from Luzon and the Visayas, encouraged by promises of land and prosperity, moved into Mindanao, often at the expense of indigenous and Moro communities. For the Kolibugan, this wave of settlement meant dispossession, marginalization, and cultural erasure. The legacy of these settlements continues today. In many municipalities of the Zamboanga Peninsula, Christian settlers dominate political and economic life. Land once cultivated by Kolibugan farmers now lies under titles issued to migrants or corporations. Local governance structures are often led by settler elites, leaving Kolibugan voices sidelined. This imbalance fosters ongoing tensions. While outwardly peaceful, underlying grievances over land, representation, and cultural recognition persist. Yet, the relationship is not purely adversarial. Daily life in Mindanao requires interdependence. Kolibugan communities trade agricultural produce and fish with settler markets, attend schools run by Christian teachers, and interact in workplaces where settlers and Muslims work side by side. Over generations, intermarriages have also occurred, producing families that embody yet another layer of hybridity. In these relationships, mutual adaptation occurs, with Kolibugan adopting aspects of settler culture and settlers learning to respect Islamic and indigenous practices. Religious difference, however, remains a challenge. The dominance of Catholic festivals and practices in public life often marginalizes Muslim and indigenous traditions. Kolibugan children in state schools frequently learn more about Christian holidays than about their own rituals, contributing to cultural erosion. Prejudices also persist, with Kolibugan sometimes stereotyped as backward or less civilized. These stigmas, rooted in colonial-era narratives, continue to shape interactions with wider Philippine society. Despite these obstacles, interfaith dialogue and peace-building initiatives have created new spaces for understanding. Kolibugan leaders participate in programs that bring Muslims, Christians, and Lumad together to discuss coexistence, development, and peace. In these contexts, the Kolibugan act as bridges, embodying hybridity not as confusion, but as a model for pluralism. Their lived reality demonstrates that identity need not be singular or exclusive. It can be layered, adaptive, and inclusive. In this way, the Kolibugan contribute a powerful lesson to Philippine society. That peace in Mindanao requires not only treaties and policies, but also genuine respect for the complexity of identities. Their interfaith and intercultural relations show that coexistence is possible, but only if histories of dispossession are addressed and cultural recognition is granted. The Kalibugan enter the 21st century with a deep historical legacy of resilience, but also with daunting challenges that threaten their cultural survival. At the forefront is the issue of land dispossession, which has plagued them for centuries. Despite the passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, and international frameworks such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Kolibugan communities still struggle to secure legal recognition of their ancestral domains. Mining companies, agribusiness ventures, and settler expansion continue to encroach on their lands, often with the backing of local elites and political patrons. Without secure land tenure, their identity remains under constant threat as the rivers, forests, and mountains that form the bedrock of their culture are steadily eroded. Cultural erosion is another pressing challenge. Younger generations, drawn to urban centers for education and employment, often distance themselves from traditional practices. Many Kolibugan youth no longer speak their dialect fluently, and rituals like the bucklog risk fading into obscurity. While some embrace Islam more deeply, adopting global Islamic practices, others assimilate into mainstream Filipino culture, leaving behind the hybrid heritage that defines Kolibugan identity. Elders worry that if cultural transmission weakens further, future generations may lose the delicate balance between Subanen traditions and Islamic faith that has sustained their people for centuries. Marginalization in political representation also persists. Whether in local governments dominated by settlers, regional structures privileging larger Moro groups, or national frameworks that lump them under broad categories, the Kolibugan remain underrepresented. Their voices are rarely heard in policy-making arenas, making it difficult to address systemic inequities in education, healthcare, and livelihood. This political invisibility reinforces cycles of poverty and underdevelopment, pushing many Kolibugan into vulnerable positions as migrant laborers or informal workers. On top of these structural challenges, the Kolibugan face the growing impacts of climate change. Flooding, droughts, and typhoons disrupt agricultural cycles, while rising sea levels threaten coastal settlements. For people whose identity is intimately tied to rivers and coasts, environmental instability is more than a natural hazard. It is an existential crisis. Adapting to these changes while defending their ancestral stewardship of the environment is among the most urgent challenges they face in the 21st century. Despite these challenges, the Kolibugan's history demonstrates that they are not passive victims, but active agents of survival and transformation. The future holds many possibilities for empowerment, provided that their resilience is matched with opportunities for recognition and support. One pathway lies in the strengthening of ancestral domain claims. By securing certificates of ancestral domain title, CATs, under IPRA, Kolibugan communities can establish legal ownership of their lands, protecting them from encroachment. Several communities are already pursuing this path, combining oral histories, cultural mapping, and legal advocacy to assert their rights. These efforts not only secure land, but also revitalize identity, as the process of documenting traditions reinforces communal pride and continuity. Cultural revitalization is another powerful avenue. The recognition of the bucklog ritual by UNESCO has opened doors for international support, funding, and visibility. Cultural workers and educators within Kolibugan communities are seizing this opportunity, organizing workshops, festivals, and storytelling sessions to ensure that rituals, songs, and dances are passed to younger generations. The incorporation of Kolibugan history and language into local school curricula, supported by mother tongue education policies, represents a promising step toward ensuring cultural survival. Religion, too, offers a path to renewal. While some worry that global Islamic influences may erase Subanen traditions, others see the potential for a unique Kolibugan Islamic identity, one that embraces faith without abandoning indigenous roots. By framing environmental stewardship, social justice, and cultural preservation within Islamic teachings, Kolibugan leaders can mobilize communities to defend their heritage as part of a moral duty. This fusion reflects their long history of adaptation, proving that hybridity can be a strength in shaping a future that is both rooted and dynamic. Political empowerment is also emerging as a possibility. Kolibugan youth, educated in universities and connected through social media, are increasingly entering advocacy spaces, NGOs, and even local politics. Their ability to articulate identity in both academic and grassroots language allows them to bridge gaps between tradition and modernity. If supported with proper training, networks, and platforms, they can challenge political invisibility and demand representation not only as Moro or Lumad, but as Kolibugan, a distinct people with distinct needs and contributions. The Kolibugan's resilience in the past suggests that empowerment in the future is not only possible, but inevitable, as long as they continue to adapt, organize, and assert their identity in creative and courageous ways. What does the future hold for the Kolibugan? Their history offers a clue: survival through adaptation, strength through hybridity, and continuity through resilience. Unlike groups that see hybridity as a dilution of identity, the Kolibugan embrace it as their defining essence. Their dual heritage, Subanen and Islamic, is not a contradiction, but a synthesis that has allowed them to navigate centuries of colonization, rebellion, and marginalization. In the future, this hybridity may become their greatest asset. One vision of the future is rooted in cultural sovereignty. By reclaiming their ancestral lands and revitalizing traditions, the Kolibugan can ensure that their identity thrives on their own terms. This does not mean isolating themselves from the wider Philippine society, but asserting recognition as a people whose uniqueness enriches the nation's diversity. With proper recognition, the Kolibugan can serve as a model of coexistence, demonstrating how indigenous and Islamic traditions can harmonize without erasing one another. Another vision lies in intercultural and interfaith leadership. Positioned between Moro and Lumad identities, the Kolibugan are uniquely equipped to mediate conflicts and foster dialogue in Mindanao. Their ability to understand multiple perspectives, born of their hybrid identity, positions them as bridge builders in peace building and governance. In a region long plagued by mistrust and division, the Kolibugan's lived experience of duality can inspire pluralism and cooperation. A third vision rests in youth-driven renewal. Kolibugan youth today inhabit a globalized world, connected by technology and exposed to international discourses on human rights, climate justice, and cultural survival. They're already producing research, organizing movements, and amplifying their voices online. The future will likely see more Kolibugan professionals, artists, and leaders who proudly assert their heritage while shaping it for new generations. They will not only preserve identity, but reimagine it, ensuring its relevance in the 21st century. Ultimately, the Kolibugan's future is not a choice between being Subanen or Moro, indigenous or Muslim, traditional or modern. It is about embracing all these facets as part of a living identity that evolves without losing its roots. Their story, from the rivers of their ancestors to the global stage of today, is proof that identity is not static but dynamic, and that survival comes not from purity but from resilience and adaptation. As the Kalibugan step into the future, they carry with them the lessons of the past, that even on the margins, they are never invisible, that even in hybridity, they are whole, and that their journey, though difficult, is a vital thread in the rich tapestry of Mindanao and the Philippines. And that brings us to the end of today's journey into the story of the Kolibugan. We explored their origins as Subanen River people, their transformation through Islamization, their struggles under colonization and martial law, their fight for land and recognition, and their resilience in the face of globalization. The moral of their story is clear. Identity is not about choosing between two worlds, but about weaving them together into something stronger. The Kolibugan remind us that survival comes not from purity, but from resilience, adaptation, and the courage to hold on to what matters most. Thank you for staying with me here on History Teller YT. If you enjoyed this journey and want to uncover more hidden chapters of history, don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and join me again for the next story. Until then, keep the past alive, because every story we tell shapes the world we live in.